So thank you so much for joining me for today's Art Chat conversation. This is a series of conversations that will be taking place during the run of our Landscape, Climate, the Environment, and Beyond exhibition. And these chats will feature conversations with some of the artists who are included in the exhibition. We're very pleased to have the artist Judy Bales with us today. Building on over 30 years of experience in diverse artistic endeavors, including as a fiber artist, a fashion artist, and a public art design team member, Judy Bales creates art that is the improbable marriage of cold industrial materials and the sensuous qualities of nature. She utilizes industrial materials, many of which are found, recycled, or salvaged, in an ongoing effort to reveal beauty in unlikely places. Bales, who received both her BFA and MFA degrees from the University of Georgia, majored in painting as an undergraduate and completed her postgraduate work in fiber art. While closer to a fiber artist in her choice of materials, she approaches her art more like an abstract painter, relying on improvisation and painterly techniques, rather than the more precise, controlled approach traditionally favored by fiber artists. Bales continually exhibits her work and has shown in over 80 group and solo exhibitions throughout the US, as well as in Canada and New Zealand. So thank you so much for joining me today, Judy, and welcome to this Art Chats conversation.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Wonderful. I want to start by showing the work that is in the landscape exhibition, which is titled After the Harvest from 2023. And I think this is maybe a good place to start. Can you tell us more about this piece and what led to the creation of this work?
Sure. I'll say first that all of my work is driven by curiosity, and it's not necessarily like curiosity about the big questions in life. It's just simple curiosity, like what happens if I take this material and do something with it that it's not supposed to be doing, or how would this look if I did this thing? And so this particular piece, I have a long history with wrapping as a technique. And I've wrapped a lot of wire fencing. And I was in Menards one day and I always go to the fencing area, or uh, that part of Menards that has all kinds of plastic and metal fencing. And I noticed the snow fencing, which is, it's bright yellow or bright orange, and you see it in the winter in the landscape to control drifts in the Midwest. And it has interesting, the apertures are interesting, and the width of the plastic is wider than the wire I was used to wrapping. So I started thinking, well, how would that be? For one thing, how would that drape as a garment? How would that be if I use that fencing as a fabric, or as a cloth? And then what would it be like if I was wrapping it? So I bought the roll, I cut this really pretty large cape form out of it. And it was so much harder than I anticipated compared to wire wrapping, which stays rigid and it's easy to make that motion. The flexibility of this plastic, kind of flimsy plastic, was much harder to cover and to keep that bright yellow from showing through, which it still peeks through some, but I was able to wrap it. And so I think I started this last winter, and I showed it at Omaha Fashion Week in August. And I probably worked an hour or two most evenings on this piece. And I literally did not finish until it was shown in Omaha. So that wasn't solid work, but it took me months and months to actually wrap all of these elements. So that was kind of a surprise to me. And this is more how it looked on the runway with the model in heels and styling and everything. I did another piece with the snow fencing. I believe we have yes, I use a kind of satin. The one that's in the show is is old tablecloths that so very literally recycled. And those tablecloths have a history. And so I layered that onto this hours and hours of labor onto this very um, mundane plastic that comes out of our industrial and our agricultural age and environment. So I also tried this with the satin. The satin was salvaged from Goodwill. You know, they have rolls of fabric and it's brand new, but it's salvaged because somebody discarded it. And so that was a totally different approach to this rather than that kind of down home earthy look of the recycled tablecloths. I wanted to see what it would look like with a more sumptuous fabric. And after these two, I actually started another piece with the snow fencing, but then I decided I really don't think I want to continue using snow fencing as a material a lot.
Mm,
Um, I'm I feel that these two pieces are quite successful, but unlike wire fencing that I've used for years and years, I don't think that snow fencing will become, a mainstay of my studio.
mm.
Uh, Although I may use it in other applications. Yeah.
Sure. And is that because of some of that difficulty of working with the material that it doesn't lend
Exactly.
itself?
And actually more than the working with it, because I'm not afraid of, hours and hours and hours of work. I think most
Yeah.
fiber artists are used to that. I think it was the fact that it was difficult to get a drape that
Mm,
I really had to work with these on the model. And at certain angles, it didn't quite look right. And in fact, when I brought it up to the museum, I spent quite a bit of time arranging it on the mannequin there until I was satisfied with it. So in that way, it doesn't give me quite the flexibility that some of the materials and some of the fabrics that I use do. But
sure.
it was very important to me for the uh, continuum and the evolution of my work.
Hmm. And it's interesting that you mentioned that as I was looking at these images and thinking about the first image that we saw and also how we see the garment in the landscape exhibition, kind of compared to the more high fashion image. I was
Mhm.
wondering about how it moves when the model's actually wearing it. So how did it look on the runway or when it's moving?
There is a flow to it. It did still, and I should have included a runway picture. In the runway, the model was wearing it much more to the side, and that is on my website. If anyone is interested in viewing my website. But there is an element of stiffness to it, because of the density of the fabric on a broad plastic element.
Mm,
Um, so yeah, I don't know how to quite describe that other than
sure.
showing the video of
Yeah.
it. But I sometimes I when I have fashion pieces in gallery shows, sometimes there is a combined element of having models. And
Hmm.
that's often not at all practical, but when it is practical, it's really a great counterpoint to having the pieces on a mannequin. And
Hmm.
it's an ongoing challenge with fashion design, uh, for my ideal, because I do show in galleries and museums. My ideal is that I want my fashion work to be able to be shown as a sculpture and then also to look good with movement and with a model and with different models. And sometimes one is favored and the other not.
Hmm.
Um, and actually, in this case, I believe it's better as a sculptural form
Sure,
on a
sure.
mannequin. Although it was quite successful in the body of work that I did. Yeah.
Yeah, how interesting. I did want to ask you too. I know that this piece connects to nature and the landscape, and of course, it's in this landscape exhibition. So I'm wondering if you could talk a bit more about that, how this piece connects to that idea of landscape, and how I know that you explore nature a lot in your work. So how has that given you greater insight into the contemporary landscape?
Well, for one thing about this piece in particular, if I look out my back door, we live in an old farmhouse that is not that. I mean, that's a landscape near me, but that's not my house. But you have in this PowerPoint several images of the landscape, and they're all just from out my door. So they're all in my very immediate environment. We have an old farmhouse, but only about an acre and a third, and all around us are the former the agriculture that this farmhouse was once a part of. So directly out my back door, it actually looks quite when the fields are cut down in the fall. Um, and I don't have a picture of exactly that, but it's very, very much like after the harvest, and that's why the name, because that those tablecloths just kind of they kind of fray a bit, and when the fields are cut down and there's just the spiky bits of the corn or soybean stalks that are still showing in the fall, and then the grid, um, the geometric quality of those fields, it's very, very much like the surface of that. And all of those connections, they always come to me later. I never set out thinking this is going to be about the fields behind my house. But after it was done, and I start looking around me and the seasons change, then I start realizing kind of these subliminal um, visual impressions of the land. And it started happening a lot more. Let's see, I moved to Iowa in 1984, and then my husband and I bought this, and we lived right in Fairfield, tiny town, but still we were right in this little town, literally on the square in an apartment. And then in 1989, we moved out to this farmhouse. And once I did, I had moved from Georgia, and it was only after we moved out here that I really started becoming more in touch with the change of seasons, with the changes of time and day, and just all the rhythms of nature, even though it was heavily agriculture. But there's still always, when I photograph the landscape around my house, I always choose the part that is just very much more connected to the natural environment than the fields around me. So both are sort of a part of our Midwestern and our Iowa landscape.
Wonderful. And how did you first become interested in repurposing these very industrial materials in your work? And what do they provide that maybe more traditional art making media does not?
I started with these materials after undergraduate school. I got my teaching certificate, and I taught in a very poor county in Georgia for several years before I went back to graduate school. And I taught art. And because it was not a lot of funds in that county, the principal was a former art teacher, and she would bring me all kinds of materials that were salvage. I mean, you used to be able to get these big stalks of telephone wire, of multiple colors, and that was back in the 70s. And it was very flexible and just a wonderful material. And she would just bring me all kinds of things that she found, or cardboard. And the younger the children, the more excited they got about these materials. And that was very freeing for me. And when I look back on that, it's shocking to me to realize how constricted I was in my own creativity.
Mhm.
and how much these children kind of brought that out in me, just watching them. And I remember in college, a group of art students having a Christmas party, and my friend that was giving it asked everyone to bring a handmade Christmas ornament. And I remember being absolutely stumped. I was so insecure about making something and bringing it and showing it to everybody. And now I cannot imagine being stumped by somebody telling me to make an ornament and bring it
Mhm.
somewhere. And so when I think back about how my mind was working at that time and how rigid I was in my ideas about art, I realize how much uh, being with those children just opened me up to creative exploration, and also the such importance of education, because when I was growing up, I went to school in the um, 50s and 60s. And where I was, really the only art education was an art teacher that would come around maybe once a month. And it was basically crayons and paper or paint and paper, and nothing of the incredibly rich resources and materials and techniques that are provided for our children now. And
Mhm.
just if I mean, clearly I came through that, and I've spent, 40 years as an adult making art out of um you know, going outside of the traditional painting and drawing and those things that I kind of that's how I felt. That's what I felt art was about, or sculpture, growing up. So it wasn't that hard over time to get out of that after I, was exposed to more in education. But it's just so important, I think, that education is maintained for
Mhm.
for young children, because then you don't have to realize in your 20s that there's a whole world out there to explore in terms of art. And then I think I just always, I love the shine of the wire. I was just always attracted to going to hardware stores or
Mhm.
building supply stores. And
Mhm.
then also in the Midwest, um, it's amazing how, like, the fencing that I use a lot, when you see discarded fencing out in a field or in a ditch, it's amazing how much it looks like a natural form, especially when it's gotten crumpled, or it's rusted, or pieces of equipment or pieces of sheet metal when they rust. All of that, if you leave anything at all in nature long enough, nature will reclaim it.
Mhm.
And then it starts looking more and more organic. So I do love that. Or I've seen trees that have grown up through, like a bale of wire or something, and they're completely intertwined, and you can no longer um, separate what's the tree and what's this rusted wire.
Mhm.
So that's fascinating to me, uh, that relationship between the industrial, or the agricultural and industrial, I kind of link together, and natural form.
Great. And I've
Yeah.
got I've got some works here on the screen from the 80s. So would that be kind of this early period for you when you're kind of first experimenting with these elements?
Yes, it was early in my career, although I mean, these were fairly sophisticated expressions by the time I got to these, but
Sure.
that was, I mean, we are talking from the 80s, so several decades back. And although I did those, I believe after I moved to Iowa, I would say that those are and these were maybe 10 to 12 inches tall. So they're vessel forms. And at the time I was doing American Craft Council shows, and my husband was a ceramist at the time, and we would both show at those. And sculptural vessels kind of came into, I won't I won't say came into vogue, but people were working in basketry, and they uh, and it was becoming more and more sculptural in the craft world. So let's see, if you go back one slide to
Hmm.
those landscapes, those I just pulled these off the internet, but even though those vessels that you just showed were done in Iowa, they still were very, I think I was still very steeped in the landscape of Georgia, where I moved from. And in the South, there's this plant called kudzu. It was brought over from Japan in the early part of the 20th century, very invasive.
Mm.
Can be kind of scary because it will literally take over small buildings or abandoned fields or forest. And but it's got this real kind of like the agriculture we see here. There's also this real beauty to it, like the agriculture we have in Iowa, which can be very destructive, but it also has this beautiful geometry to it.
Mm.
And this plant life in Georgia and plants like kudzu, they're very grotto-like, they're very mysterious. Like I said, a little bit scary in a way, because it grows so fast. So there's this, and it's destructive. The kudzu is destructive. So there's this push-pull of beauty and danger or destruction in
Mm.
nature. And then on the far right, it's just that's just showing the lushness of the southern landscape even in a garden, that we don't see that kind of quite that level of lushness in the Midwest, even at the height of spring. And then as time moved on, these are from the more like the early 90s. These are, and again, as I looked back over the years and started looking at my images together in sequence, I realized that after a few years of living in our farmhouse and being surrounded by, looking at the fields and there are woodlands near us, but looking at all of that daily, these works, I was still fascinated with the industrial materials, but the works were getting much more expansive. These are very collage-like, and they're perhaps 3 to 4 feet tall.
Mm.
So they're still vessel forms, and a lot of salvaged wire materials or metal materials, sometimes from building supplies. There's some copper wire in there. Um, some plastics, and these were stitched together with wire, with a fine wire. A friend of mine who's a jeweler came upon, I think from a salvage yard, she got, oh, several hundred pounds of this Army surplus wire that had been used as tripwire or mine wire. Um, I'm not sure, maybe after the Vietnam War, but it's stiff and it absolutely disappears because that's what it's meant to do. And so it was like stitching with a needle without a needle. I mean, I could just stitch with this very fine but very stiff and yet flexible wire and stitch um, these collage-like pieces of the fabric of the, excuse me, of the metal or the fencing together into these forms. So that was yeah, so stitching still was a part of that. And let's see, going back one slide to those landscapes. This again is this is winter
Mhm.
around my house, same area. And hopefully you can just see the comparison of the greater horizontal quality of the landscape and greater planes of shapes than you
Yeah.
see in the southern landscape that I was used to. Yeah.
Judy, with creating both wearable art and what you do with kind of your fashion design, and then also more sculptural pieces, does your approach to the work change based on kind of that end goal, depending on what it's going to be?
It certainly does, although sometimes I have had sculptural pieces that turn into fashion and fashion pieces that go the other way.
Mm.
So if they just don't work in one of those for one of those goals, then sometimes they can, if it just doesn't work as a garment, then maybe I'll turn it into a sculpture. Um, there's certainly a huge issue with fashion of literal engineering of making it fit to a human form, and especially with my materials, being able to for the model to wear that with some level of comfort, even if it's just for the runway. Um, and there's let's see, if you go back up, let's see, about maybe, yeah, okay, this slide, this was okay, on the left is a piece called Star Flock, and this is aluminum screen. And this has always been, I think of my work often as being related to biomimicry. Not exactly. Biomimicry is, I think it's mostly used in technology where structures or systems are created that are useful, that are not natural, that are not directly like natural systems, but they're based on that. And so I think of that visually with my work in, and the term the title Starflock is evocative of that in this piece, because I felt like, so I cut the screen, I did all the stuff that you don't do with window screen. It's supposed to keep bugs out and dust and be flat and tight. And so I rip it and I tear it and I fold it. And I made these, and these elements became very star-like. So I started putting them together. And so it's evocative of, constellations, but also of flights of birds, of insects, possibly even water or other plant phenomenon. So it's, in my mind, this is very much like a natural object, and yet it's not. And it's not like any one particular, it's not literally a group of stars or a group of birds. And then this is an incident, this is a case where in the garment on the right, which was shown at Georgia College in Milledgeville, Georgia, that was exactly the same materials. I usually don't have that close of a connection between the sculptural work and the garment. In this case, I think I actually used some of the, they actually went back and forth. I used some of a wall piece and fitted it for the body. Or I think maybe later I took that garment piece and incorporated it back into a wall piece. So, but that's a little bit unusual, and it's, a very scratchy piece. My models are never complain, but I did start having a desire to do work that was a little bit softer for the comfort of the model. And sometimes I'll put these things on and just walk around the house in them for a while to realize what it's like for somebody to wear them, and that can be kind of sobering to me.
Yeah.
um, Here again, this is not the water that's shown here. Very water-like forms, and there's not this kind of the I think it's a Japanese woodcut that I'm showing there in the middle. There's not that type of image in nature that we see so much in the Midwest, but certainly in my travels in Western North Carolina, in, or travels to the beach, or to mountains where there are rivers, there's more of this great flow of water. And again, after doing these pieces, I realized that's kind of where that comes from. And then it feeds back. It's like a feedback loop because then I start naming it. The one on the right, I think I titled, yeah, Ocean Blue.
Mhm.
And that was these plastic loofahs that you get for um, for the bath, for the shower.
Mhm.
And if you clip the cord that keeps them in a bunch, then you just have this wonderful stream of this very lightweight mesh that you can pull apart easily with your fingers. So it's kind of fragile, but they're inexpensive, and you can, so I made that piece out of those. And that was shown at the Cedar Rapids Art Museum several years ago in a show titled Into the Blue.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And I know we're running a little low on time. And so as I want to touch briefly on your public works of art projects
Mhm.
as well.
Sure.
So as we head to those images, we'll
Mhm.
scroll through some more of your fashion work and some runway images.
Okay.
And some inspirations from one of the shows.
That's right, for the slide that just came before
Yeah.
that, which was inspired by the Rococo and also by the Rococo fashion, Rococo and Baroque, and also the landscape paintings of
Mm-hmm.
that period. And that, I think, is the only line of fashion that I've done that was all fabric. So it was, and so that was a bit unusual. And yet again, I think that my approach was very painterly. It was improvisational. I was still using that same approach that I use when I work with unusual material, with non-traditional materials.
Sure.
Yeah.
And just before we open it up to questions, I just wanted to share a couple of the public works of art that you've worked on. This one is from Phoenix, and I believe you were telling me that you were part of this project from the very beginning.
That's right. This was an amazing project for me to be. I actually applied for this because the prospectus said that they needed an artist to design a cage for a bicycle bridge that goes over I-17 in Phoenix. And of course, all bicycle bridges have to have a protective covering for safety. And I had been doing these art forms that kind of related to cages, the wire grids. And so I just decided to apply for it, and was incredibly fortunate to be awarded that project. And there was no bridge here at all when I got the project. So I collaborated with the engineer and engineering team from the very beginning so that we together uh, created decided on the form of the bridge, and then these interwoven and the height of it. It was very tall, um, and the way the artwork would integrate in with the structural elements. And I did a residency with local school children uh, to kind of bring the community more on board with this bridge going in their neighborhood or adjacent to their neighborhood. And in the lower image, there are these recessed areas that I did the project with them, and based on all of these, and taught um, a whole little course for these elementary school kids on bridges.
Mhm.
And they created uh, drawings and prints of bridges. And then I took their work and created these abstract images that you see that were then recessed into the concrete. It was a delicate thing because in the worst case, you can end up with something like, kids' handprints in the concrete, or something that's really not, that involves the children and involves the community, but isn't sophisticated.
Mhm.
So it was a delicate balance to use their work and yet have something that I felt um, comfortable as an as an abstract pattern as well.
Mhm.
But so there was also the design of the ramps because the bridge is so high, it has to get the bicyclist or the pedestrians down in a curvilinear way in a small space down to the level of the trail. Um, I, it, I, I'm such an intuitive thinker, and this required so much analytical thinking that it was like I almost felt like I could literally feel my brain, the two sides kind of coming into sync a little bit better. So it was really good for me to have this incredible challenge. And I really immersed myself in bridges for about 10 years. And I developed an incredible respect for what engineers do. And I also came to understand very deeply for myself that artists and architects are only putting icing on the cake when it comes to bridges. There are a few engineers worldwide that are actually making structural art where they're taking the engineering principles and creating their own aesthetics. But I mean, architects can't create bridges. It requires a structural engineer, and artists can't really do anything but make it a little more aesthetic. And if the engineer has already done that, then that's the highest form of bridging. So bridge creation. So that became a little problematic for me in a way. And uh or by problematic, I just mean that I started thinking I'm just not sure that this is ultimately that I want to just be adding decorative elements
Mm,
to something.
sure.
But it was absolutely just one of the most amazing experiences uh, to be in a project like that from the ground up. And yeah,
Wonderful. Well, I want to make
yeah.
sure that we have enough time for questions here. So I think we'll go ahead and open it up. And are there any questions for Judy about her work?
Hey, Judy, it's Sean.
Hi, Sean.
I had a question for you about the piece that's in the exhibition and its companion piece that you did that was made, I think you said in satin.
Right.
And I get the aesthetic difference between the two of them. Did you notice did they flow differently when they were being worn by the models? Did you have a preference between the two, the one that was made out of tablecloths and the one that was made out of satin? Did one perform better for you?
The one after the harvest performed a bit better. It had more flexibility and more drape. I don't quite know why, because the satin is also maybe the satin was actually a little stiffer because it was new,
Hmm.
even though it was from a thrift store, it was new. And the tablecloths had been through so many washings. Um, And now that you ask that, I'm thinking that that might be why that gave more of a drape and more flexibility, a little bit more to the to the one that's in the show.
Hmm.
So yeah, the satin one became on the runway, and I'm sorry I didn't include those slides, but became more of a plain.
Hmm.
And so that which is interesting in itself, because if it's worn to the side, then you just have this grid, this kind of soft grid that the model is wearing. But ideally for me, one of my plans is to make a whole line of capes or cloaks, and so the drape is critical when you're making a cloak or a cape. And again, that was an extreme learning experience for me, because I don't think I want to plan something that I want to drape and then use these materials again. So it was, and spend all that time and then realize this isn't doing exactly what I want. And that's one of the both exciting things and the pitfalls of using materials that have not been used for a particular purpose so much before, because you can do hours or months of work and realize that it's not quite doing what you anticipated. And I find I can never truly anticipate what's going to happen until I actually do it. And that's also part of the excitement, is that unknown, that I really don't know how this material is going to behave until I just sit down and do it. So that's kind of exciting. Yeah.
Any other questions for Judy?
I have a follow-up question to that. So I know, sorry, I know that the satin came from the Goodwill store, but were the tablecloths like family pieces, or where are you finding a lot of the materials that, say, you attach to your early vessel forms and that sort of, where are you sourcing a lot of these materials from?
Um, it's amazing, because when people, there's so much fabric in the world from people that sew, and when people realize that, or when they know I'm working with a certain material, it's unbelievable how many people will offer me materials, and fabric is no exception. And funnily, those tablecloths we used many, many years for Thanksgiving and holiday, meals. But I had actually gotten them at I think it was a home store that was going out of business, in Georgia, when I was visiting my brother. And I remember, buying these tablecloths. But actually, even those tablecloths I needed far more fabric. So I was bringing more fabrics that were related from thrift stores, or just that I found in my own supply, and who knows where they came from, because I have more fabric than I'll ever use, and most sewers will say that. um, and there's probably at least, I'm going to guess, maybe at least 10 or 15 different fabrics in this piece, although the tablecloths were the dominant. But I had to keep filling in once I used up an entire tablecloth. I had to find something else that related. Yet another challenge of, I didn't want it to look like, uh-oh, I ran out. I have to, what do I do? So I had to make it integrate. And yeah.
Well, I have just one more question for you, Judy. What is next for you? What are you working on? What's coming up next?
Well, the applications are open for Omaha Fashion Week for this August, and I'm in a pattern now of doing that show every August. It's the most stressful and the most exciting thing I do every year. It's literally 6 months of work and then less than 10 minutes, my work on the runway. So it's a huge adrenaline rush, very different from a gallery or museum show, where you can always kind of stand back and reassess. And this is like, it's all or nothing, that 10 minutes, of showtime. So that's pretty exciting. And then you do have photos and everything. So that's wonderful. But I also have 3 shows that are lined up for 2025. One solo show, which will be predominantly fashion, maybe a little bit of the sculptural work to give balance, and then 2-person shows, one in Quad Cities and one in at Indian Hills College in Ottumwa, and that will be with my husband, who's a photographer. And but all 3 of those shows, fashion will be the dominant thing that I show. So I'm really excited about having those lined up, because a lot of times I don't, things come up more quickly, and so to have this plan for next year is really great for me.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
And I know we're excited to see what you do next too. So it's
Thank
been
you.
wonderful today to get this idea of more of your career and how you've kind of come to where you're at right now in your artistic work. So I want to thank you so much for joining us today, Judy. This has been such a pleasure. So thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure for me. Thank you for
Great.
asking me.
And I
Okay.
just wanted to mention before we end that next month's art chat will be with artist Jeremy Chen on Wednesday, April 17th at noon. And so I hope you can join us for that as well, everyone. So thank you so much for being here today. And thank you again to Judy. And enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.